I'm sure at some point in time, you've read comic books, watched films, either live action, animated, or otherwise about superpowered saviors. You know, the big muscular men and women in tights who go around defending the planet from world-conquering warlords or eldritch abominations? They're real. They're all real. At least, in my dimension they are. I'm even one of them. And I'm pretty sure I'm also the last of them. In fact, I'm probably the last surviving member of the human race. But most would hardly consider me human after my enhancements, shall I say. My name is Victor, but when they were still around, the public called me Rubble. It's a bit corny, I know, but I didn't necessarily pick it out. It just kinda picked up steam on social media after a particularly destructive fight I had with some creature that emerged from underground to tear apart Manhattan. I didn't look much different from your average guy. I was under 6 foot, had short black hair. The experiments the fats did on me did increase my muscle mass a bit, but I wasn't The Rock or Arnold Schwarzenegger by any means. The powers I was given were pretty standard, although I had never tested the true limits of them. I had only a rough idea of what I was capable of. The first of these powers was superhuman strength, that has once allowed me to lift an entire US aircraft carrier. Don't know the weight off the top of my head, so I'll just go with a hell of a lot. But even after that, it still felt like I had plenty of strength to spare. Next was flight, because who doesn't want to soar across the clouds, am I right? Although you do end up swallowing quite a few bugs if you're not careful. Best to wear some goggles if you don't have the reaction time to evade them. Third was superhuman speed and reflexes. Gotta be able to react and travel quickly. I thought the super hearing was great too, until I overheard several conversations that I didn't need to or want to. It was more of a curse than a blessing at first, but eventually I learned how to tune most things out. But there were still a few slip-ups here and there. I was supposedly given an increased lifespan as well. Not complete immortality or anything, but I currently sit at a little over 40 years old and don't look a day over 25. And finally, I was gifted with increased durability, which I also never had the limits of tested. But to get the basics out of the way, I was impervious to all conventional gunfire. I once survived the explosion of a skyscraper while inside of it without so much as a scratch. It did send me flying though, so there's that. My old director even said I should have tried to see if I could withstand a nuclear blast. And while the street cred of being able to say I took the full force of a Tsar Bomba would be great, I didn't want to take the risk of being wrong and end up vaporized. But despite how I make it sound, I'm not invincible by any means. I've bled and have been mostly overpowered by monsters and other beings with similar abilities to myself. Once had a couple of teeth knocked out by some sort of Cthulhu-looking thing that rose up from the depths of the ocean and tried to wipe out everything along the coastline. I stopped it, but it ended up putting me in the hospital. A hospital specifically designed and built to heal and hold enhanced people. Regardless, those were the glory days. The times I took for granted. And oh how I wish I could go back to them. Humanity was wiped out some months ago by a hostile alien species known as the Proctons. The cities and towns that used to hold and house thousands are now nothing more than charred graveyards and outposts for some of the Proctons. From what I know, the extermination, as I call it, was worldwide, across the entire globe. They weakened every country's forces. I did my best. All of us enhanced people did, but it wasn't enough. The individual members of their species by themselves aren't very strong or powerful, but their technology was at least decades beyond anything here on Earth, and as a result, our fight against them was pretty one-sided. For starters, I mentioned possessing superhuman speed and reflexes. And sure, I could avoid a bullet or two here and there if I put the effort in, but lasers were a different story, and they have a ton of them. On top of that, Some had advanced armor suits that endowed them with just enough strength to even stand a chance against me. Usually, in a one-on-one, I was capable of overcoming that. But once they attacked in numbers, it was either retreat or die for me. There were the suits, the tanks, the aircrafts. Hell, they even have sonic grenades, which doesn't exactly pair well with super hearing. Regardless, my surroundings told me that I was one of the only people left alive in the wake of the extermination. I'm sure there was someone out there somewhere, but I've become a bit doubtful that even if I do find them, they'll survive long enough for it to be meaningful. What I really want, more than anything, is to find the leader of that species of assholes and end them, publicly, in front of all of his hideous-looking errand boys. Then I can kill the rest of them too, if I can manage to get that far. One of my most notable encounters with them came when I had just flown into what remained of downtown Manhattan. It was mostly what you'd expect. Crumbled buildings with all sorts of plant and wheat growths sprouting from their empty husks. Empty cars spread amongst the streets, mostly empty anyway. Some still contained corpses within them. One had its driver door ajar with the decomposed corpse of a woman leaning halfway out, indicating she was killed while attempting to flee from her vehicle. At least she was in one piece. From the shape I've seen a lot of other bodies in, they weren't so lucky. A handful were severed in half at the waist after being shot by a laser. Some had their heads and skulls missing as a result of the sonic grenades obliterating their eardrums and brains. Even then, there was worse than that. Much worse. But I don't need to list everything. I'm sure you get the idea. Regardless, I kept cruising about 100 feet or so above the ground in Manhattan, looking down at the remnants of what was, when I suddenly heard the faint burst of a cannon. And before I could even pick a direction to look in, I was suddenly hit with the hot, explosive energy of a laser blast and was sent tumbling to the ground below. I fell at breakneck speed at an odd angle, one that allowed me to go crashing through the side of a skyscraper and come flying out of the opposite end. My impact with the pavement left multiple small craters as I somersaulted backward numerous times, before finally coming to a screeching and destructive halt. It hurt, sure, but I've taken blows far worse than that in the past. I put my hand on the cracked concrete to push myself up, but immediately stopped as I laid eyes on a somewhat grim sight sitting less than a foot from my face. It was a skull. Human, obviously. A chunk of the top right was missing though, and the jaws were agape, as if whoever it belonged to was still trying to scream. I was 99% sure that they died like that, screaming. I looked away from the unnerving sight and flew back up, while hovering a couple of feet above the pavement. I looked around for where that blast might have come from, even trying to listen out for it. I kept low and didn't dare to fly up any further. I didn't want to get myself shot right out of the sky again. But I was instead greeted with an intense, bassy shockwave of sound piercing its way into my eardrums. I cupped my hands over my ears and fell to the ground, my knees sinking an inch into the pavement as I collided. It was like someone had shoved a large speaker inside my head before turning it up to full blast. I snarled in pain while attempting to look around for the source of the horrendous noise. The sheer volume of it impaired my ability to pinpoint the location at first, but I soon noticed that one of the abandoned vehicles on the road was moving ever so slightly from side to side, as if something was making it vibrate. It sat around 50 feet ahead of me. Without taking my hands off of my ears, I took flight and quickly closed the distance, gritting my teeth as I came to a hovering stop and peered inside the shattered passenger window of the car. Inside it was a fist-sized, spherical-shaped metallic object. Two small vertical red lights flashed repeatedly on either side of it. I immediately recognized it as one of the Procton's sonic grenades. Without waiting a second longer, I descended and then threw my right foot out and kicked the car up into the stratosphere. And soon enough, the grenade was out of range to maintain its effect on me. As to why I didn't choose a less flashy method to neutralize the threat, well, whatever the hell those grenades were made of were tough. It definitely wasn't a metal present anywhere here on Earth. The last time I tried to simply crush one in my hands, it took the majority of my strength to do so. And just for perspective, bending and crushing steel for me was about as easy as destroying cardboard for a regular person. Basically, I just wanted to get the damn thing out of range as quickly as possible without having to take my hands off my ears. But now that it was gone, I could do just that. And I immediately heard a pattern of metallic clanking coming from around the street corner. It was a sound I recognized. It was the clanking of the boots of the Proctons' armored suits. So, instead of letting however many it was of them turn the corner and get the jump on me, I'd ambush them first. Without wasting a second, I quickly lunged and flew forward as fast as I could. And with ease, I smashed right through the walls of the first floor of the skyscraper that separated me and my adversaries. Dust kicked up and created a smoke-like aura as I crashed through the concrete and rebar like a speeding bullet. I grabbed the first Procton that I saw around the waist and maintained my flight speed for a slight bit longer before coming to a sudden and hard stop, which sent them crashing through the set of buildings across the street, while I stayed hovering in the center of the street. I knew it wouldn't be enough to kill him in that suit, but getting him away from the others bought me some time to gauge what this group's numbers were. I turned around while still hovering and caught a glimpse of 3 more. Guess this would be a good time to mention that these guys were hideous. They stood tall on 3 long leg-like appendages, which granted them an average height of around 6.5 feet. Through the transparent helmets of their suits were their faces, and I do mean faces plural, one on both the front and back of their heads, which their scarlet red skin was also stretched over like poorly molded Play-Doh. The features of each face on their heads consisted of 3 golf ball-sized eyes that glowed a bright pastel yellow. There was no nose to be seen, but a couple of inches below those horrendous eyes was a pair of thin, scaly lips that barely concealed their many jagged black-colored, asphalt-like teeth. They were also completely hairless. The biggest of the 3 Proctons stepped forward in his armor, and through his helmet, I could see him maintain an expressionless frown, as if he was mildly disappointed at best and completely apathetic at worst. Why so much anger in the way you confront human? Your kind had its chance, its shot at establishing a legacy in the grand game of existence. And it failed. You must learn to accept that the universe does not allow the weak to thrive, only the strong, he announced in a horribly scratchy voice, one that made me wish I had listened to nails on a chalkboard instead. "Shut the fuck up," I growled, before flying forward to tackle the monstrosity, only to be thrown to the side while en route by the impact of a laser blast. I slid down the street and tore up several yards of pavement, before regaining myself and flying right back in their direction, now furious. I stopped mid-flight and threw a punch that I practically put my whole shoulder into right at the chest area of the larger Procton. I heard the blow heavily dent the metal of his suit, before he was sent flying like a fastball, crashing through several traffic lights and building walls in the process. The other 2 Proctons quickly turned and aimed their blasters at me, but just before they could fire them off, I swiftly descended and stomped my foot into the ground hard enough to crack the very asphalt we stood on, creating enough force to knock the both of them off balance and drop their weapons. I quickly knelt down and grabbed both blasters. But before I even got the chance to toss them away, both of the Proctons jumped onto me. I jumped off the ground and began to fly up at a speed that I hoped would throw them both off immediately. But they hung tight with a vice grip. In the midst of the chaos, I dropped both of the blasters, but I still had both of them to deal with. Whatever they made their suits out of was strong enough to keep me from easily tearing right through it. And to add insult to injury, their blows when in those suits legitimately had some power behind them. Sure, they definitely weren't going to beat me to death, but there was enough force in each punch to make me wince. With both of them still on me, I couldn't even see where I was flying, which caused me to go crashing through what I thought was a floor of what used to be an office building. We tore through the floor, walls, ceiling, and various pieces of furniture, a continuous path of destruction that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars if anyone was still around to foot the bill. Once we emerged out the other side, I purposefully gave up my momentum and let the 3 of us go crashing onto the ground. The chaos of the impact was enough to get the both of them off of me. They slid across and tore up the pavement after detaching from me. But even after all that, their armor only had some small scratches here and there. I hovered a few feet above the ground and prepared to fly full force into one of the now separated Praktons. But the third one who I punched away earlier suddenly emerged and leapt onto my back. With how distracted and preoccupied I was, it was no wonder that I didn't even hear him. I simply counter-attacked by reaching back and grabbing the Prakton by the neck before then pulling him over my head and forcefully slamming him into the road below. The asphalt buckled on impact, and he became embedded a couple of inches within it. I then raised my right fist and brought it down onto the chest area of the armor with a forceful grunt. A dent formed in the shape of my knuckles and fingers where the blow connected, and the impact shook the ground around us. I then followed up with another few blows, each one more powerful than the last. And as I continued to wail on him, I felt every bit of hatred, anger and malice that I possessed for these things emerge. And my desire to hold back even in the slightest had completely faded. Each punch sent an almost earthquake-like rumble through the pavement around us. The Prakton could barely squirm before I punched him right through what little remained of the road and down into the sewer tunnel below. I fell with him, landing with my knees on his abdomen area. He looked up at me, and I could see that genuine fear emerged in his hideous eyes. "You come to my planet, kill my people, and you expect me to be rational?" I shouted with a furious snarl. "I'll kill every last one of you, and rip you limb from fucking limb." I raised my fist and prepared to come down with another blow, one that I was hoping would be the last to finally break through the armor of this monstrosity. And it likely would have, up until I felt a sudden and sharp wave of pain shoot up the length of my back. It was one of the few times I'd ever been stabbed since I had gotten my power, but the sensation was still familiar nonetheless. After I turned around and laid eyes on the Prakton who stood there, fearful, as he gripped a short, shiny silver blade in his armored appendage. Blood dripped down and nearly reached the handle before the Prakton lunged forward to take a second attempt on my life with his blade. But even with my injury, I was still fast enough to easily dodge the swing, and then throw an uppercut powerful enough to knock him back up through the asphalt of the street above us and hundreds of feet into the air above that. With all my might, I bent my knees, jumped, and then flew up with all the strength and momentum I could muster, ignoring the stinging sensation on my back and the warm blood dripping down my skin-tight outfit. The unfortunate Prakton was still dozens of yards above the street as I collided with him, and that combined with the durability of my flesh and skeleton was enough to completely split the creature in half, or as close as you could get to it with the strange anatomy of these things. His dark, violet-colored blood soaked everything from the top of my head to my lower chest. It dripped from my hair as I stopped to hover not far above where the initial collision took place. The two halves of the Prakton's armored corpse fell to the damaged road below, and I looked down at his comrade, who still laid flat on his back in the sewer tunnel below the street, his suit heavily dented as he struggled to recover from our confrontation. The third Prakton seemingly disappeared, but I didn't have time to look for him. The stinging in my back intensified. From how much blood was on the Prakton's blade, I'd say he cut me almost a full inch deep. And although I knew it wouldn't be fatal, it didn't make it hurt any less. Despite that, I knew I still had the strength to keep fighting, and I almost decided to, until I heard the distant humming and whooshing of something colossal in the distance. And it only became louder by the second. With a faint groan, I turned, and about a mile away, I could spot the shape of a Prakton aircraft heading its way over in my direction. I had encountered some before, but had not yet attempted to take one down, just flee from a couple. For starters, those things were about the size of a commercial plane, but the size wasn't the thing that made me hesitant about it. First of all, it was made from the same metal as their armored suits and sonic grenades, and the blade that I'd been stabbed in the back with, apparently, so that alone would mean I'd have to put my back into destroying it. That wasn't mentioning the cannons that were on it, which were powerful enough to knock the hell out of me, even more so than the regular rifle-sized blasters. And who knows how many Prakton reinforcements they had inside that thing. There were several of those cannons around the ship and seemed to have some sort of targeting system. They were pretty accurate, locking onto me even when I had already broken the sound barrier. On top of that, the ships could also emit a more powerful variant of the sonic grenades, which had come close to bursting my eardrums in a previous encounter, even with the short amount of time I spent being in the vicinity of its range. It was enough to make my ears bleed. With the pain of my wound slowly increasing, I figured I should bide my time for the moment and retreat before the warship was close enough to initiate an attack. Part of me felt like a coward, that I should have stayed there and finished it. But if I did that, and they were able to incapacitate or even kill me, then I would never get my hands on their leader, commander, whoever or whatever the hell it was. With a long exhale, I then turned and flew away, nearly colliding with the roof of an apartment complex as I initially took off. I kept my flight speed low enough to avoid breaking the sound barrier and alerting the Proctons in the ship to my location if they didn't already know. I turned back mid-flight just to make sure I wasn't being pursued. Despite how it sounds, I wasn't flying aimlessly to escape. I had somewhere specifically to go. A sort of safe house, if you will, if you subtract the safe part anyway. It was simply just a 2-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of an ugly grey apartment complex. There were no secret rooms with gadgets and weapons, no massive underground caves with supercomputers. Just an old, weathered, and slightly eerie expanse of long empty rooms and hallways that once bustled with life. A lot of that life was my now deceased brother, Sean, who had perished when the extermination first started. And I wasn't around to save him, and he joined the list of billions who became victims of the Procton slaughter. When arriving and making sure to land softly on the balcony, I listened out to make sure that I had put enough distance between myself and those Proctons, that it wouldn't be a problem for the time being. But once sure of myself, I stepped inside and headed straight for the bathroom. For the sake of reference, the suit I wore was nearly as durable as me. It was designed and manufactured by someone in the branch I was contracted with. They had experience making suits for various enhanced people, a couple of whom I worked and fought alongside. Those were good times, finishing the mission and stopping the bad guys, before going out for coffee together afterward, like we were just a bunch of co-workers at a business office. My suit's coloring consisted of mostly dark, almost lead grey, with a few thin accent lines of obsidian black that circle around the elbows, knees, and very end of the sleeves, along with a few jagged, almost lightning bolt-esque lines that ran across my chest area parallel to each other. Some of it had come off during my flight to get here, but a portion of it had already begun to dry and stain the material. It was just a simple 2-piece top and bottom. There was nothing like a cape, utility belt, or high-tech accessories. Most of that stuff will only hold you back in the long run, in all honesty. I wasn't sure how or where my administration got their hands on the material for this thing. Hell, I don't even know what it is. Wherever they hid the classified paperwork for it is probably nothing more than a smoldering crater by now. I turned and let my back face the bathroom mirror, and instantly frowned once I saw the stained trail of my own blood that ran down my back and my right thigh, stopping just at the back of my knee. I lifted the upper piece of my suit to get a better look at the wound, my hand still half covered in the Procton blood. The cut had already begun to close up. Still, there was a bit of dried blood that sat around it. It wasn't more than half an inch in vertical length, and it would likely be completely gone within the next couple of days, not even a scar. After examining the wound and washing up a bit, I headed back into the living area of the apartment and sat on the couch, a feeling of defeat washing over me. There I was, sitting down after the world had ended, and despite all that had been given, I felt just powerless, as if every effort I made was in vain. Ultimately, no matter what I did, it wouldn't bring everyone back. This wasn't how things were supposed to turn out. In every superhero movie ever, the protagonist punches the bad guy, saves the day, and maybe loses a side character here and there at most. Sure, one might say it's not completely my fault, and from a purely logical and rational standpoint, I agree. But human beings are not, never have been, or never will be purely logical creatures. Never. Guess what I'm trying to say is that it gets harder and harder every day to find ways to convince myself that I truly did everything that I could do, that I only lost because the odds were stacked so high against me that it wasn't a matter of failure, but a matter of fate. I fly over these streets every day, and I've seen bones far too small to belong to an adult more often than I ever wanted to. I've witnessed the remains of those who died in the arms of their loved ones, and those were just the ones that were left somewhat intact. Within hours of them first invading, they racked up a body count in the millions. From what I understand, their reason for the extermination has something to do with resource and population scarcity in their home world, and Earth was the closest neighboring planet capable of supporting life. We were barely obstacles to them. Took us out like it was some household chore. The only reason we lasted as long as we did is because we threw every enhanced person we knew of at them. Regardless, I caught myself staring at the ceiling. My eyes drifted down to the old TV stand sitting parallel to the couch. On the top of that stand was a picture of my brother Sean and me the day we had finished moving into the apartment. It was a couple of years before I had undergone any experimentation, so it was an exhausting venture. Still shocked to this day we had the energy to even take the picture. Admittedly, it was a nice quiet moment of reminiscing. I like to think about all the dumb stuff that we did as kids and got away with. My childhood was relatively pretty normal, and it was made all the better by having him around. It was a nice quiet moment, up until I heard a sudden whooshing sound come from outside my apartment balcony, as if a large projectile had quickly passed by it. Immediately, my blood began to boil, and I thought that the Proctons might have ended up following me back. I got up and threw myself forward, flying right out of the glass door gap and above the balcony. I stopped just several feet away from the balcony's safety rail and continued to hover there, listening out for the source of the whooshing noise. I didn't immediately catch sight or hear anything. Whatever it was had either gone or was simply no longer in motion. But once I focused in and caught the faint sound of a constant thumping, I was inclined to believe the latter. It originated from somewhere above me, and I had heard enough heartbeats in my time to recognize what it was. After peering up, I did a double take upon seeing a woman hovering above me. Aside from the eyes that glowed a bright lapis color and her levitating even higher than me, she appeared human. But all of that was without mentioning the fact that her torso was covered in what looked to be fresh Procton blood. It slowly dripped off, nearly hitting me on the top of my head. And while I was happy to have encountered not only another enhanced survivor, but one that seemed to be just as happy to take these bastards out as I was, there was just one thing that made me more than a bit hesitant to welcome her presence. Her attire. It was a tight-fitted white suit, similar to mine beside the color, although most of that color had been distorted by the blood. But in the upper left side of the chest area were 5 numbers, along with a capital letter P at the beginning of the digits. Her suit was a jumpsuit, a super jumpsuit if you will. And the line of numbers was her prisoner ID number. She was an inmate at a federal prison for the enhanced, and the particular prison that suit had come from housed enhanced who had committed some truly atrocious acts. For context, you would have to have a body count of at least 10 before they would consider putting you in there for just murder. Her stare intensified, and I tried to contemplate how I should react. After all, I only knew she could fly. I wasn't familiar with her particular power set. Perhaps she could open black holes at will, or could control living flesh and would telekinetically tear my skin from my bones if I made a wrong or threatening move. So the last thing I needed to do was provoke her, before I knew what I was dealing with. Although it seemed my idling was beginning to irritate her, and her expression shifted into that of disappointment, I suppose. It was honestly hard to tell. Part of me was taken aback when she chuckled weakly. "It's rubble, isn't it? She asked in a way I concluded to be rhetorical. "Do you remember me?" Her voice was soft, but also paradoxically hoarse. "Can't say that I do," I replied, feeling myself tense up a bit. "Of course you don't, but it doesn't matter, because soon enough, you will, even after you're nothing but a pile of smoldering ash." Then, in one swift motion that was fast enough to even catch me off guard, she raised her right hand, and it began to glow a bright blue lapis hue, the same shade as her eyes. The pulsating color then spread its way up the length of her arm, looking as if someone had just activated a glow stick. The first of my kind that I'd seen in months. And they were already trying to kill me. Figures.